So, comedy and religion, that's kind of nuts, huh? Still, this is why I get the big bucks. But before I reveal the meaning of life, let's look at the meaning of laughter, which has a haphazard relationship with humor. Sigmund Freud said smiling and laughter are coping mechanisms, processing both happiness and sadness. We cry with joy, we laugh in despair. The ways humans express emotions defy easy categories. For instance, what's this man feeling? What he's feeling is horror, devastation, agony. He's an Iraq war vet talking about finding his best friend dead during a firefight.
I saw his face, how it was, kind of messed up. I wanted to cry, but didn't.
In the infamous Milgram experiment, where volunteers gave electric shocks to students, some of the volunteers were so horrified at what they did, they began laughing hysterically. Certainly it's true that comedy often comes from people in pain. In fact, a study of YouTube videos that I just made up found that 88% were of people falling down. The other 12% were miniature pigs getting their bellies rubbed. Charlie Chaplin said, "Life is a tragedy when seen in close-up, but a comedy in long shot." What's the difference between a close-up and a long shot? The difference is distance. The famous formula, comedy equals tragedy plus time, is, I think, a version of the same thing, because time is a form of distance. And Mel Brooks's famous dictum, tragedy is when I cut my finger, comedy is when you walk into an open sewer and die, is also about distance. It's funny when it happens away from me, not to me. But that's weird. After all, seeing someone horribly injured is horrible. So why would anyone laugh at the suffering of these three gentlemen?
But God, what that climbing spike! Oh, my head!
So, you just saw one man scalded with a blowtorch and another gouged in the eye with a steel spike. Not exactly chuckles galore, which is, by the way, my stripper name. But some of you were laughing, and none of you were 12-year-old boys. So why? What in that scene distances us? Well, it's silly, it's cartoony, its unrealness is a form of distance. But cartoony means bigger and broader than real life, right? And their reactions to pain were actually smaller. Think about it, that spike got an ow. In real life, a steel spike in your eye would probably produce more than ow. By not hearing howls of anguish or seeing gushing blood, the audience is cued to laugh rather than say puke. Still, we are laughing at someone's pain. And in fact, philosopher Henri Bergson, who's not often paired with the Three Stooges, said comedy requires a momentary anesthesia of the heart. In the movie Home Alone, a kid inflicts infinite varieties of pain on two burglars. Try watching that with a fully engaged, sympathetic, deeply feeling heart. Let's not forget that laughter is at its core a biological phenomenon. And on a neurological level, the key to funny is patterns. So the basis of that sketch, the basis of all comedy, is playing with pattern recognition. Watching Pythons with Pies, we're using our pattern recognition skills to try to figure out what will happen next, even as we suspect it won't be what we expect. The weird thing of that state of knowing we don't know how the pattern will be altered isn't frustrating or irritating, but pleasurable. As we try to figure out what will happen, suspecting our guess will be wrong, we go into a heightened state of excitement where our confusion itself feels good. This explains why we sometimes laugh before the punchline, a phenomenon known to scientists as premature ejaculation. Where it gets really interesting is the idea that searching for patterns isn't deliberate like exercise, but a reflex like breathing. One evolutionary reason we're here and gorillas are in the zoo is that we're really good at guessing. When our condos were caves, figuring out patterns got us food and kept us safe. Back then, our only choices were to be smart or be dinner. And here's an insight that's worth its weight in gold, though I also accept Bitcoin. Pattern recognition may have started as an ability, but it became an addiction. Humans need meaning. Cryptographer Paul Kocher says our brains aren't wired to understand randomness. Anyone know what this is? It's an optical illusion called an impossible object. It can't exist. When most people see it, they think pitchfork because the mind's immediate reaction to incongruity, a mystery, a puzzle, is to solve it, to resolve it, even if it's unresolvable. And it's not just visual. Ever been walking in the woods and you hear a voice that's really the wind in the trees? Hearing that voice is called apophenia, the human need to find patterns in the random. Turning chaos into order helps us feel safe in a chaotic world, and as a bonus allows conspiracy theories to thrive and Jesus to appear in tamales. So it's not just that we resist meaninglessness. Humans are wired to make meaning and order. The ancient Greeks disagreed. They believed reason and order came from God and was called logos, which is where we get our word logic. But anything funny is illogical. Comedy comes from surprise. If something's logical, there's no laugh. Comedy aside, the question of what's underneath a human-constructed order is above my pay grade, especially since it can lead to disturbing conclusions. To paraphrase avant-garde composer John Cage, we really do need a structure so we can pretend we're not nowhere. We're all supposedly made in God's image, but we haven't really lived up to that, and we know it. Mark Twain said, "Man is the only animal who blushes or needs to." St. Augustine said that in his youth his credo was, "God make me good, but not yet." Groucho Marx said, "Those are my principles, and if you don't like them, I have others." But no one can always be noble because, among other reasons, people don't agree about what nobility is. Comedy lives in the gap between our princely principles and our shabby shortcomings, like the decision faced by a college freshman underneath his very drunk date. He made the right decision, but most of the characters in Animal House don't, and we laugh. Critic Louis Cronenberg says comedy is concerned with human imperfection, with people's failure to measure up to the world's or their own conception of excellence. Cronenberg believes that in showing the vast gulf between our aspirations and limitations, comedy becomes our conscience. Through laughing at others, we purge ourselves of spiteful and ungenerous instincts. As I said, comedy isn't cruelty, it's empathy. And it gives us hope. Tragedy is about noble heroes brought low by terrible flaws. Comedy is about small, foolish people who usually win. In tragedy, we feel anguish at the noble hero's failure. In comedy, we take heart at the foolish hero's small victories. He may not conquer Rome, but he gets the girl. Or to be gender sensitive, she may not conquer Rome, but she gets the girl. Which means that small, foolish people like us have a chance at a happy ending. Knock, knock. God. Great, a room full of atheists. Let's talk about faith. To which the obvious response is, you're a comedy guy. Where you should excuse the expression hell, do you get off talking about faith? Well, a form of faith is central to comedy. I broke up with my girlfriend a little while ago. It was very painful. We had different religious beliefs. She was an atheist, and at the time I thought I was God. Many, many years ago, I was a stand-up who mostly did weird little conceptual bits. I only had one joke, that one. It got good reactions, maybe because it takes a moment to decipher. She's an atheist, he thinks he's God, so, Figuring something out gives us a sense of triumph. That's why explaining a joke kills it. The pleasure we get from the punchline is partly our delight at having deciphered its mystery. That has a relationship to religious faith. Religion takes life's greatest mysteries, who are we, what do our lives mean, where are my tennis socks, and provides answers. When we take a leap of religious faith, we're pleased that we know life's answers, especially when compared to people who believe those other ridiculous religions. Ridiculous because they're not ours. But faith doesn't ask us to understand the mysteries. It just tells us to accept someone else's explanation. It's as if you didn't like my atheist joke until I said, "Trust me, it's funny. Trust me, it's funny." We talked about the comedy formulas of Chaplin and Brooks. Disney theme park designer Eddie Sato has an interesting entertainment formula. Fear minus death equals fun. Go on this roller coaster, forget there's no actual danger, and we'll give you a good time. There's a similar bargain in comedy. All jokes, all humor, and all narrative fiction, for that matter, start with a premise, what comedy people call a gimme, that a priest, a rabbi, and a gecko would go into a bar. The power of premise is considerable. Here's a comedy premise from Seth Rogen telling 40-year-old virgin Steve Carell how to pick up girls.
Just ask questions, okay? That's it.
Can I help you?
I don't know. Can you?
So the premise is that you can seduce women by just asking questions. Is that true? No, but we pretend it's true because we know if we do, we may get a reward, laughter. The gimme, the premise, is a contract between artist and audience. You could say a similar thing happens with religion. In comedy, accept the premise and you get a laugh. In religion, accept a higher power and you get eternal life, unconditional love, and answers to all questions. This could explain why there are more religious people than stand-ups. Accepting a premise is called suspension of disbelief, which is another way of saying faith. Comedy and religion have very different worldviews. It's interesting that all surveys about the religious beliefs of comedians, and I should mention that there are no surveys about the religious beliefs of comedians, they all show a significant number of atheists and agnostics. My explanation of this provocative, if non-existent data is that skepticism is the mother's milk of comedy. It's almost impossible to view the world credulously, then make fun of it. Religion looks at humanity and says, this clay made of God can, by following our precepts, attain a form of divinity. Comedy looks at humanity and says, this clay made of God farts. By the way, have you ever thought about why farts are funny? The English poet Edward Lear wrote about a duchess who farted at one of her elegant dinner parties. She turned to her butler and said, Hawkins, stop that. Hawkins said, certainly, Your Grace, which way did it go? Farts are funny because they're a gaseous rebuttal from the butt of humans' pretensions to superiority. Yes, people make poetry and pyramids, but we also pee, puke, and poop, like cows and gerbils. Do you object to being called an animal? Hugh Hefner pointed out the only alternatives are minerals and vegetables. A woman came up to James Joyce at a party and said, I want to kiss the hand of the man who wrote Ulysses. Joyce said, let me remind you, madam, this hand has done many other things as well. Yeah, we're disgusting. Just look at all that stuff that comes out of our bodies. But why do we think they're gross? Tears come out of the eyes and they're not gross, but snot is. If tears are fine and snot is not, what's the difference between tears and snot? And I'm proud to say this is one of the few talks you'll ever go to which ask that question. Any answers? Tears come from emotion, from the brain and the heart, not just the body. Farting, vomiting, shitting, hunger, sex, injury, disease, and the 1,000 or so natural shocks that flesh is heir to, they expose our underlying animal natures and how the soul is tantalized, as Bergson puts it, corrupted by the needs of the body. Take the little tramp again. So what are we laughing at there? I'd say it's Chaplin's insolence and ingenuity and agility, which is fine, but it ignores the bigger picture. He's stealing, and from some poor working stiff who's working Skid Row, probably not doing much better than him. Bergson said, any incident is comic that calls our attention to the physical in a person when it's the moral side that's concerned. Because the tramp's hungry, and we like and identify with him, we admire his spirit and physical prowess, and totally ignore the ethics, the morals of the situation. Bergson doesn't just mean moral literally, though it includes that. He means it to represent our souls, our potential nobility, as opposed to our animalistic bodies, which are driven by uncontrollable needs and appetites. That physical moral split is one of the key components of comedy, and when we laugh, we're recognizing it. What do people want? Everything, anything. Wanting is what people do. Desire for power, riches, safety, danger is the driving force of every life, which means it's the driving force of every story. Tricksters spent thousands of years mocking those desires, which include the hopeless hunger to understand our lives and a senseless, destructive universe. H.L. Mencken said, God is a comedian playing to an audience too afraid to laugh. God made us flawed, then gave us a world filled with misery and pain, and instead of laughing at the absurdity or howling at the injustice, we worship him. How funny is that? But it's one way to deal with the bleakness of life. Lord Byron wrote, and if I laugh at any mortal thing, 'tis that I may not weep. Groucho said, I wouldn't have spent so much time trying to make people happy if I hadn't known sadness. If you don't think the bleakness of life can be funny, talk to Vladimir and Estragon. Here's the end of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot.
I can't go on like this.
That's what you think.
Other than Shakespeare's exit pursued by a bear, probably the most famous stage direction in theater history is there at the end. Let's go, says Estragon, and Beckett writes, they do not move. They're trapped, in Beckett's view, by their knowledge that going on is futile and that we have no other choice. Well, one other choice. And for our purposes, the key moment in that scene is when Estragon takes off his belt to commit suicide and his pants fall down. One of art's greatest convergences of comedy and tragedy. In medieval Italy, a man consults a physician of the mind. I am perpetually afflicted by melancholy, he says, and it's been like this since I can remember. I feel I have no choice but to take my own life. Don't despair, says the doctor. There's a jester in the city called Calaveri, and they say he's the merriest man alive. No one can watch his performance and remain unhappy. Take my advice and see him immediately. You don't understand, says the man. I am Calaveri. The myth of the sad clown is a myth. The comic temperament encompasses everyone from Marin to Fallon. Asked whether all comedians are manic depressives, Chris Rock points out that
any group of people that think for a living is going to be sad. We always say ignorance is bliss. So what's the opposite? So manic depressive? Nah, but definitely not as happy as the average idiot.
George Santayana said everything in nature is lyrical in its essence, tragic in its fate, and comic in its existence. So is that the core of comedy, that we're funny because we're doomed? If that's true, how does laughing make anything better? I think comedy reminds us that life may be miserable, but it's not hopeless. Yay! Does comedy do anything else? Well, it's always jarring us with evidence that we're no better than other people and comforting us that most people are no better than us. It makes us more critical, yet leaves us more tolerant, and that is a notable social function. Well, thank you, Lou. It's also been said that a key purpose of art is to create a commonality of experience, and what's more communal than shared laughter? And laughter gives us courage, lightening frightening things in people by cutting them down, making them look ridiculous. And shrinking fear helps us grow. Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin said, laughter demolishes fear and piety, allowing us to investigate the world freely. The Dalai Lama told Monty Python's John Cleese that when you laugh, it's easier to take in new ideas. Comedy gives your mind the freedom to explore complex and subtle ideas in a way that's visceral and memorable. But comedy's not some namby-pamby, touchy-feely, happy-go-lucky yuck fest. In freeing us from fear and inspiring our imaginations, laughter has real social and political power, which makes it dangerous to the elites. Freud said, humor is not resigned, it's rebellious. Sam Harris, the best-selling author on atheism, says, love entails the loss to some degree of our self-absorption. I think the same is true of comedy. At the moment we're laughing, we're out of ourselves. Earlier I said comedy embraces skepticism over faith. The loss of ego is the way to transcendence for most of the world's religions. So maybe there is a connection. After all, just one letter separates cosmic and comic. Hey, Buddhism's so connected to comedy that its logo is a laughing, half-naked fat guy. Laughter's power brings us back to Trickster, who isn't just a jester, but for some cultures a doorway to divinity. But how can comedy be related to the sacred? I think the link is the concept of religious ecstasy, when you're suddenly filled with the Spirit of God, which can be defined as a sudden, unexpected revelation. It's been said by me, but you have to admit that counts as being said, that everyone's first comedy routine is peekaboo, which is a sudden, unexpected revelation. So why comedy? Because everything about it shows the resilience of our bodies and our souls, which means it's really about defying death. Oedipus, Lear, Willy Loman, they all fall down and they don't get up. Chaplin and Keaton fall down and then they get up. Tragedy says if we overcome our flaws, we can be strong, principled, and heroic. Comedy knows that'll never happen and celebrates what we are, weak, corrupt, frightened, but raucously, defiantly, not dead yet. Doctor tells a guy, I have terrible news, you have cancer and Alzheimer's. Guy says, well, thank God I don't have cancer. I think comedy's like that. It helps us forget what we know is coming. What's coming? A guy named Hamlet passes an open grave, picks up a grinning skull. Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest. Who was Yorick? What was his job? Jester. The profession Shakespeare chose to show the inevitability of death was stand-up comedian. But where be your jibes now, says Hamlet, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment? That image is graphic proof that behind the jester's laugh is a grinning skull. If there is such a thing as the human comedy, life is just a long setup to a terrible punchline, and comedy tells us the great unpleasant truths. Life is out of our control, language fails, our bodies fail, underneath we're all animals, and we're all going to die. If God does order the universe, comedy could be seen as anti-divine, in the way it's always disrupting society, language, order. Yet every culture sees the divine in comedy. Maybe that's because embracing our mischievous, transgressive, uncivilized selves, we acknowledge and accept the vastness of human experience and existence, yet still fight it out with both God and the universe over that whole death thing. When you honestly face our utter helplessness and our inevitable doom, what can you do except laugh or cry? I choose laugh. Especially shared laughter, which we've had a bit of here, and which I do think is a form of communion. No less powerful when you're sitting in an auditorium looking at a screen than when you're sitting in a church looking at a pulpit. Communion, love, bliss. Humanity is always pursuing ecstasy, with art, adventure, religion, and sometimes actual ecstasy. Also sex. You could say ecstatic bliss is what happens at the moment of orgasm. I wouldn't, because I don't wallow in filth, but I think you would. Like sex, laughter only lasts a couple seconds. That's weird. I see lots of the women nodding grimly. But during those few seconds of laughter, we're not thinking about our jobs or relationships or war or poverty or disease. We're out of our minds, outside of time, our everyday world and inevitable end forgotten. In that ephemeral but transcendent moment, there's no pain, no ego, no countdown, just pure rapture, an instant of bliss where we seem to merge, if only for a moment, with some greater consciousness. Poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti wondered if the music of the spheres is some kind of mad, mad laughter. Maybe the joy, the ecstasy that's concentrated in a single giggle is a tiny touch of transcendence that gives us a glancing glimpse of God. And I'll take transcendence however I get it, or a sudden revelation of the divine, or a good fart joke. But maybe they're the same thing. Thank you.